14th century, this guy, Dante Alighieri, wrote a hilarious poem, an instant classic, The Divine Comedy. In it he incorporates all sorts of historical characters whose fame or infamy readers still recognize today. Figures such as Brutus, Judas, the devil. But there are also other figures in this story whose names and deeds modern audiences might be a little less familiar with. In Canto 32 of the poem, our narrator is in the ninth circle of hell, an icy and frozen lake of a wasteland reserved for the worst kind of betrayers and committers of treason. A place of unmatched misery and endless suffering, where the damned cry for all eternity, and their tears form the frozen lake around them. It is in this setting that Dante and his guide, Virgil, discover a pair of damned souls condemned to spend eternity with their bodies half frozen in the icy lake. One of the men sits slightly higher than the other, his face buried in his neighbor's scalp as he gnaws and chews away at the man's head and neck, biting and chewing before wiping his mouth in his victim's hair, then repeating the process over again. Dante describes the scene. I saw two shades frozen in a single hole, packed so close one head hooded the other one. The way the starving devour their bread, the soul above had clenched the other with his teeth, where the brain meets the nape. The two men are Ugolino Gherardesca, a former count of the Italian Republic of Pisa, and the man he is eating is Ruggieri Ubaldini, a former archbishop of that same city. But who are these men, and what were their crimes that put them in such a place with the likes of Brutus, Judas, and Satan himself? This is the story of Ugolino della Gherardesca. This is the story of the man in the tower. Italy in the 13th century was a land beset with division and strife as two parties vied for power and political domination. On one side were the Ghibellines, who were supporters of the Holy Roman Emperor in his rule over Italy, among other things. And on the other side of the conflict were the Guelphs, who supported the Pope and the independent rule of Italian city-states. The origins of the conflict went back centuries, but suffice it to say this was a time of great political violence, danger, and uncertainty. Many battles were fought, cities besieged, and entire communities destroyed. It was in this climate that Ugolino della Gherardesca was born, around the year 1214 CE, to the noble family of Gherardesca, who, as rulers in the Republic of Pisa, were fervent Ghibellines. Indeed, it had been their support of the Hohenstaufen emperors that had led to them becoming the rulers of various lands in the first place. Ugolino himself was Count of Donoratico, a few miles to the south, the city of Pisa. Pisa was a republic surrounded by enemies. It was a Ghibelline city whose neighbors were Guelph. To make matters worse, two of those neighboring cities, Florence and Genoa, were rivals in the all-important game of trade. Times were hard in Pisa, and so to survive the unique situation, the city adopted a unique form of government that focused on strength and security, and that was headed by a singular office called the Podesta, an individual with extraordinary powers that some would consider tyrannical, more akin to a dictator than the leader of a free city. As a member of the nobility, Ugolino would have grown up in a privileged household where he would have learned the ways of the aristocracy. Here he would have learned how to run a nobleman's court or manage a city. As his later life would suggest, he may have had a talent for administration and development. He may also have had martial training, as was common in his age. Young nobles would have been schooled in the use of the sword, the wearing of armor, and the proper implementation of tactics on the battlefield, both on land and at sea. By the time he was in his 40s, Ugolino was involved in a war with the neighboring Judicat of Cagliari, which was essentially the southern quarter of the island of Sardinia. As with the other conflicts in this story, the origins of this war precede our tale by many decades, but the simplest context of this conflict goes as follows. Cagliari was an attractive plot of land with valuable resources that her neighbors wanted. As I mentioned earlier, Italy, and by extension the surrounding areas such as Sardinia, were, in this time, extremely violent, with almost constant war and generational conflict being the norm, with political intrigue and warring with neighbors being the rule as opposed to the exception. And the story was no different in the Judicat of Cagliari, which had been struggling to survive for years in the increasing chaos around them. The Judicat struggled to maintain autonomy while appeasing diplomats from the various republics of Pisa, Florence, Genoa, as well as the other factions of the Guelphs and Ghibellines. But the fact of the matter was that autonomy, at least for the Judicat of Cagliari, could not last forever. They were at the very center of a cold war that was growing hotter by the day, and soon they would need to choose a side. By the 1250s, Pisan influence in the Judicat of Cagliari was at an all-time high. When, in the year 1256, the then Judicat of Cagliari, a man called John, attempted to throw off the influence of Pisa by forming an alliance with the Republic of Genoa. For the Pisans, this was unacceptable. The only response could be war. Bold though he may have been, John was soon assassinated by Pisan assassins. The Judicat then went to his cousin, William, who could do little save prepare for war. Such is the context of the war that Ugolino now found himself fighting in. As the Podesta of Pisa, Ugolino was the man in charge, and he was not going to stand idly by and watch his rival, the Republic of Genoa, expand their influence unchecked. Later in 1256, Cagliari was invaded, and its capital, Santa Agia, was besieged by Pisan forces. By 1258, the war was over. Santa Agia was destroyed, and the Judicat of Cagliari came to an end. Ugolino and the Gherardesca then became the owners of the conquered lands, winning for themselves the region's rich silver mines and mineral-rich soils. There, Ugolino founded the city of Villa della Chiesa, today's Iglesias. The following years may have been the greatest of Ugolino's career. Not only was he the head of the wealthy and prominent noble family Gherardesca and the Count of Donoratico, he was also the leader of the Ghibelline parties inside of Pisa, Podesta of Pisa, and now a successful conqueror and founder of cities. His ownership of Sardinian silver mines would have made him a wealthy man, and his successes could not have but made him feel even more secure. But in a time so restless and so violent as his own, such security could never last. Pisa's enemies were always near. They were always watching, always planning. Ugolino began to fear, as men do, that he might lose his power. It could be Guelphs, it could even be Ghibellines. Or it could be Genoa, it could be Florence, it could be anyone. Ugolino was an aging and increasingly insecure man. He needed friends, and he didn't care who they were. In 1271, Ugolino would make the first of what would come to be several grave mistakes. Seeking an alliance with another powerful family, Ugolino married off his sister to the powerful Giovanni Visconti, judge of Gallura, one of the 4 kingdoms of Sardinia. The Visconti were an influential Pisan family with money, power, and connections, but they were also Guelphs. And not just obscure followers either. Giovanni Visconti was the leader of the Guelphs in Pisa, the leader of a rival religious faction. This understandably made the Ghibellines in Pisa suspicious of their leader Ugolino. Order in the city began to erode, and by the year 1274 it had reached a point of crisis. Ugolino and his brother-in-law Giovanni Visconti were both arrested and accused of plotting to turn Pisa over to the Guelphs. The very air of security, superstition, and paranoia that they had helped cultivate had now come to claim them as victims. Ugolino was imprisoned, while Giovanni Visconti was sent into exile. He died shortly thereafter, in the year 1275. And Ugolino, no longer seen as a threat, was released from prison and himself sent into exile. He would have been in his 60s at this point, and perhaps the citizens of Pisa believed he'd used up all the fight he had in him. They were wrong. In exile, Ugolino began to plot his revenge. He had been a rich and powerful man, and his influence still carried. He knew diplomacy, he knew statecraft, he knew how to win allies, and he knew how to defeat his enemies. Soon, Ugolino had himself a powerful ally in the form of Charles I of Anjou, king of modern-day France, and a long-time enemy of the Ghibellines. Charles had years of experience fighting in Italy and working in tandem with the Guelphs. With his help, Ugolino was able to return to his home city with an army at his back. Ugolino had reached a point where Guelph and Ghibelline didn't seem to matter anymore to him. He had once been a powerful man in the city and the Republic of Pisa, and he wanted that back. Against this attack, the city of Pisa stood little chance, and it was soon forced to surrender to Ugolino under humiliating terms. Ugolino was pardoned of any crimes, as were any other exiles that had been affiliated with him. Ugolino had been beaten, but he had returned home and restored the Gherardisca name to something of its former glory. But he had also learned a lesson in dabbling with high politics. It was a dangerous game, and fortunes could fall far quicker than they could rise. So he abstained from politics for a time, working instead through subtler means to re-establish his family's influence. He would have power again someday, but it would require time and patience. In the year 1284, war once again broke out between Pisa and her rival, the Republic of Genoa. At that time, the Podesta of Pisa was a Venetian man called Albertino Morosini, and he rallied to the war by mobilizing the navy and appointing Ugolino as captain of half the fleet. The ships sailed out, and on August 6th, 1284, the Pisan fleets met the Republic of Genoa's at the Battle of Miloria. At the Battle of Miloria, a Genoese fleet of some 88 ships approached a stationary fleet of 72 Pisan ships that were lying in wait around the port city of Porto Pisano. The Pisan fleet represented nearly all the might the city had to offer, including the flower of the nobility, for nearly every noble family was present. Men in armor of chain and plate, with heavy helmets and heavier weapons, edged, spiked, beaked, and hooked. Fighting alongside them would have been thousands of men-at-arms, professional soldiers dressed in every sort of armor from half-plate to simple gambesons, and armed with every weapon of the day, from swords, maces, axes, and halberds, to javelins, bows, and crossbows. In the fleet opposing them, the Genoese fleet, the soldiers would have looked much the same, dressed for a medieval battle, only one that was going to take place on the seas and not on land. The standard practice of naval battle in the day was to ram and board. The fighting would be up close and personal. It would be violent, and it would be deadly. The Genoese, seeking a decisive victory, drew up in formation outside of the port, hoping to lure the Pisans out of their defensive positions and to crush them in a single engagement. Fortunately for them, their plan worked. Soon the Pisans came sailing out in a single body, charging right at the Genoese fleet. It is said that while blessing the Pisan fleet, the top of the archbishop's staff fell off, a dread omen, but one that was disregarded by the Pisans, for they didn't need God so long as they had the wind on their side. As the Pisan fleet crashed into the first lines of the Genoese, they were caught off guard by a flanking squadron of Genoese galleys that smashed through the still advancing column of Pisan ships. The battle quickly turned to a disaster for the Pisans as their attack was squandered and their fleet crumbled. Ships smashed together in a shower of splinters and screaming men. Grappling hooks flew and snared, oars scythed into churning waves or open air. Bows broke and sterns shattered as the Pisan fleet was nearly swallowed up by the Genoese galleys. Pisan losses were staggering. 35 to 37 ships were sunk, 5,000 men died, 11,000 more were captured, including Albertino Morosini, the Podesta of Pisa. It was, for the Republic of Pisa, a catastrophic disaster from which they would never recover. In the chaos and confusion, there was one squadron of Pisan ships that had not gone down, however. A squadron that had already struck its colors and signaled for retreat. That squadron was, of course, none other than Ugolino's, turning away and sailing back to Pisa. The Battle of Miloria was a major defeat for the Republic of Pisa, but their problems were just beginning. Florence and Lucca, seeing an opportunity, pounced, launching an attack on the battered and weakened Republic. In a state of chaos, Pisa needed a new Podesta, so the city appointed one of their last surviving nobles with any real influence, any real experience, hoping that he could save them. That man was Ugolino della Gherardesca. Desperate to save himself, his family, and perhaps Pisa, Ugolino immediately began a strategy of appeasing the invaders by surrendering certain castles. In these types of wars, where fighting and death was a constant, seizing a castle without a siege or a prolonged battle was a major victory. The attackers were satisfied. Victorious, the Republic of Genoa offered an end to the fighting. Pisa would be forced to pay reparations as well as ransoms for the thousands of captured men, many of whom belonged to noble families. The terms might have been hard, but they could have been far worse. Yet Ugolino, the man in charge, refused. Many of those noble prisoners were the leading Ghibellines of Pisa, a.k.a. Ugolino's political rivals. If they were set free to return to the Republic, Ugolino's authority would be stripped in no time, and he might even find himself banished again, or worse. As the single most influential nobleman in Pisa, Ugolino further solidified his power when he was appointed Capitan del Popolo, captain of the people, for a period of 10 years. He was now the single most powerful politician in all of Pisa. But there was a catch. His power, great as it was, could not be absolute. He had to share power. Nino Visconti was the son of the aforementioned Giovanni Visconti and the nephew of Ugolino. Born in 1265, Nino would have been 23 years old in 1288 when he began to share power with his uncle. Nino was young, professional, and capable. He had already been running his family estate for over a decade, and doing so rather well. When his chaplain was found taking bribes, Nino had the man hanged, demonstrating his sense of piety and justice. He was exactly the sort of man his uncle would have been most suspicious of. Shared power between the two men could never last, and soon they began to quarrel. It is at this point in our story when we are introduced to that second shade whom Dante encountered in the depths of hell, the man whose brainstem is being eaten for all of eternity, Ruggieri Ubaldini. Ruggieri had been the Archbishop of Pisa since 1278. He knew well the simmering conflict of the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, and he may even have tried to settle conflict peacefully on one or more occasions. Though by the time of Ugolino's falling out with Nino Visconti, it seems the alleged holy man had seen enough. Ruggieri would have well known the conflict of the Guelph and Ghibelline, but he would have also been familiar with medieval Italian politics. He knew when and how to strike. The story here is somewhat muddled, but what is clear is that Ugolino and Nino were quickly falling out, and that Ruggieri soon became entangled in the conflict in one way or another. It may be that Nino sought his help as the archbishop, and seeking to play both sides off of each other, Ruggieri only pretended to be friends, then betrayed the young Visconti's plans to Ugolino. Or it may be that Ugolino simply heard that the two were discussing an alliance against him. In any case, Ugolino launched a preemptive attack on his nephew and several other prominent Ghibelline families, driving them from Pisa and destroying their palaces. Next, he occupied the town hall and had himself declared lord of the city. It had taken his entire life, years of scheming, planning, and fighting, but at long last, Ugolino had achieved absolute power over the city of Pisa. He had made enemies of the nobility, the people, and both sides of the factions warring around him, but he had finally made himself lord of the city. It was then in the year 1287, and in April of that year, terms of peace with the Republic of Genoa were again rejected by Ugolino, who still feared the return of all those captured nobles. They had been captive now for years, and their hate for Ugolino in that time would have only multiplied. Many of them had not liked him before he had sailed away from the Battle of Miloria. Now they were swearing oaths of vengeance against him. In the meantime, the Republic of Genoa had attacked and seized the Pisan port of Porto Pisano. They destroyed any remaining ships, tore down the docks, and filled in the harbor with land. From that moment forward, Pisa was utterly crippled, and she ceased to be a naval power in the Mediterranean. The next year, in 1288, surrounded by enemies and losing in a war, food became scarce, and prices in Pisa surged to new highs. The already angry populace were reaching their limit. Riots sprang up throughout the city, and mobs took to the streets. Soldier met citizen, as Ugolino refused to hear the mob's demands, and the violence only grew worse. During a confrontation with one of these mobs, Ugolino killed a young man, and this was the final straw that the camel could bear, for that young man was none other than the nephew of the only remaining person of influence who was not already trying to destroy Ugolino. That man was the Archbishop Ruggieri. As Ruggieri's nephew bled to death in the streets of Pisa, so too bled away any hopes Ugolino could have had of forming an alliance with the Church. It truly was now just him and his closest supporters against everyone. On the 1st of July, 1288, Ugolino again heard terms of a peace treaty with Genoa. As he and his entourage left the council meeting, they were set upon by a mob of armed citizens who attacked suddenly with swords and daggers. Ugolino was by no means a young man at this point, but was nevertheless able to withdraw to the town hall with the help of his bodyguards, the mob pursuing them all the way. Inside the hall, the few defenders managed to drive off their assailants long enough to board shut the entrances and fortify against any further attacks. He'd survived the ambush, but if he thought he would be saved, Ugolino was foolishly mistaken. When the mob outside the town hall only grew in size, it became clear who was leading them: Archbishop Ruggieri. All the city was now against the barricaded old man and his last supporters. They called for blood, chanting charges of treason at Ugolino and his family. The town hall was surrounded. Then it was set on fire. As smoke filled the rooms and the panicked screams of his supporters sounded around him, Ugolino at last agreed to surrender, though not before settling on some terms. He and his supporters would not be torn limb from limb upon leaving the town hall. The Archbishop Ruggieri may even have agreed to treat him nobly, or he may have promised them a path into exile. We simply don't know, although stories suggest the Archbishop employed a degree of trickery in luring out old Ugolino. Defeated for the final time, Ugolino, along with his 2 sons and 2 grandsons, was brought to the Muda, a fortified stone tower owned by another noble family, the Gulandi. There they were confined, while the Archbishop took it upon himself to rebuild the city. He appointed himself podesta and oversaw the trial of Ugolino and the Gherardesca family. Months later, in March 1289, while Ugolino and his family were still confined to the Muda, the Archbishop Ruggieri ordered the doors to the tower to be locked and the keys thrown into the Arno. Ugolino and his sons were sealed in the tower to be forgotten about. Their sentence was to die of starvation. In the following days, screams and cries could be heard echoing out from the Muda. Fists banged on the heavy door. Faces or hands showed in windows. Starvation is a terrible way to die. It is long and drawn out and far from painless. Before the end, it wreaks havoc on the brain, and it can cause madness. By the time of the 3rd day of Ugolino and his son's confinement, the screams would have lessened. The banging on the doors would have ceased. By the 4th day, there would have only been murmurs and groans. By the 5th and 6th day, Ugolino, his 2 sons, and his 2 grandsons would have all been dead. Or were they? For years after the event, rumors abounded that Ugolino had actually eaten his own sons and grandsons. Deep in the bowels of hell, frozen for eternity in the 9th circle, Dante has Ugolino explain himself thusly. Confined to the tower, it wasn't long before hunger began to grip him, and soon Ugolino began to eat his own hands. This is when his sons and grandsons say to him, "Father, our pain," they said, will lessen if you eat us. You are the one who clothed us with this wicked flesh. We plead for you to be the one to strip it away. Ugolino continues. And I, already going blind, groped over my brood, calling to them, though I had watched them die for 2 long days. It is then that Dante has Ugolino speak one of the most famous lines in all the poem. Then fasting had more power than grief. Ugolino had eaten his sons. Or at least that's what the popular culture of the time liked to believe. It was a wicked and evil end to a man who many believed to be wicked and evil. Ugolino had betrayed many people in his lifetime and made many enemies. The list of individuals who were sad to hear he had starved to death in a tower could not have been very long. Ugolino was seen as a traitor to his city, to his people, to the Ghibellines, and to everyone else he had ever had much affiliation with. So the idea that he could also betray his own family in such a vile way and cannibalize them was an idea too believable for the people of the time to discount. Here was the image of an old and embittered man, sitting in a dark and empty tower, slowly eating the flesh of his own children as he sat and waited, plotting his revenge for the day when that door to that tower opened once again. He had survived so much in the past, defeat, exile, and always he had returned with a vengeance. Could he do it again? Putting Dante aside for a moment, there is no actual evidence of this gruesome cannibalism. In 2002, paleoanthropologists conducted DNA testing on the recently exhumed remains of Ugolino, his sons and grandsons, and these showed no signs of cannibalism. Testing conducted on the bones of Ugolino himself showed no sign of zinc, an indication that he had not consumed any meat in the months leading up to his death. In the actual event, Ugolino was an old man, and by far the oldest in the tower. Assuming all 5 prisoners were in relatively healthy conditions at the time the doors were sealed for good, Ugolino would have surely been the first to expire. So that's the story behind this brooding face, this man gnawing at his own fingers while his sons and grandsons clamor around him. As for Archbishop Ruggieri, well, his actions weren't without controversy. His actions were seen as brutal and merciless by some of the populace and the Pope himself, who ordered serious punishments to be handed out to Ruggieri, the man who had essentially stolen Pisa and made himself its new ruler. For a clergyman like Ruggieri, there was no escaping a punishment from the Pope himself, and his days would have been numbered. A reckoning was coming, for no man in the Church could outrun the authority of the Pope, the highest office of all matters secular. Ruggieri could have been banished, exiled, or even excommunicated. He could have been made an outlaw and hunted down without repercussions. The Pope, with all the evidence gathered, summoned a court, and then he died. The issue was put on the back burner while a new pope was elected, and nothing much ever came of it. Archbishop Ruggieri remained podesta of Pisa until he found power too slippery a thing to hold on to, and he went off to his diocese, where he lived the rest of his life before moving to Viterbo and dying in 1295. So why are these men in the 9th circle of hell? Well, Ugolino was viewed as a traitor. He sailed away from the Battle of Miloria and left his people to be killed or captured by the enemy. This in addition to his many later betrayals, and the popular belief that he'd eaten his own kids. As for Ruggieri, well, it's clear by his arrangement in eternity, slightly beneath Ugolino, forever having his head eaten, that he received the greater of the two punishments. He is in hell for his multiple betrayals as well, which the author evidently considered more severe than Ugolino's. Ruggieri not only betrayed young Nino Visconti when the latter had attempted to oust Ugolino, but he had also betrayed Ugolino as well when he tricked him out of the town hall and into his custody, only to then have him confined in a tower and starved to death. Worst of all, however, Ruggieri had betrayed God. He had been an archbishop who acted more like a count than a clergyman. He had committed two of the very worst types of betrayal: the betrayal of one who is under his hospitality, i.e. Nino Visconti, and the betrayal of one's lord and sovereign, which in his case was supposed to be God. So it is that his fate is the worse of the two. For all eternity he remains frozen in ice, only an inch or two beneath the man who he betrayed in life. And as for Ugolino, well, when he's finished telling his tale to Dante, he goes back to eating Ruggieri's head, for it's his only consolation in the eternity that is hell. He can still have his revenge on the man who locked him in the tower. Hey, thanks for watching. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider leaving a like or subscribing. That would go a long way to helping me out. I'll see you in the next video.